Well, first of all, thank you all for joining us tonight. This is our kickoff episode of River Rising Solutions. This webcast is the first of a series. My name is Shannon Blankenship. I'm the Advocacy Director at St. John's Riverkeeper, and I'm joined virtually today by my co-host, Jimmy Orth, the Executive Director. Tonight's webcast is a deep dive into the solutions being envisioned and implemented all over the world that look to address climate change, adaptation, and resiliency. And specifically, whether or not these could work here in the St. Johns River watershed. This webcast is a series because the solutions to address this complex problem, climate change, are also complex. And so each episode is going to take a look at potential solutions and allow time for further discussion with experts in the field that can help us to better understand each topic. Tonight, we're going to be joined by Nate Monroe, reporter and columnist with the Florida Times-Union, and we'll delve into the topic as the ocean creeps in, a superhighway to the sea. But before we get to that, we're going to look at a little bit of the history of St. John's Riverkeeper's work to elevate the need for resiliency planning. We'll also discuss the river itself and the changes that the river has undergone over the last century. We'll then be joined by our guest speaker, and then we're going to open up to you, the viewers, for questions and to continue that discussion. So to begin, I want to kick it over to Jimmy Orth, Executive Director, to talk to viewers about St. John's Riverkeeper, our mission, and our work.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here with you tonight. And thank you for joining us, taking the time out of your evening to learn more about this important subject tonight. If you're not familiar with Riverkeeper, we are really an advocacy group for the St. Johns River. We're a nonprofit group. A lot of people a simple explanation is we're a watchdog group for the St. John. So our job is to really be investigating pollution problems. We go out and monitor problems on the river. We go out and try to hold polluters accountable as well and try to find solutions to the problems that affect the St. Johns River. And that can be legislative solutions. And sometimes we have to find legal solutions. And so we do, on occasion, file lawsuits. Like we'll talk a little bit about tonight, but we filed a lawsuit against the Dredging project, which we're going to go into tonight a little bit. So those are some of the ways that we do it. We also really try to raise a lot of awareness in the community and engage the public. We really need a mobilized constituency for the St. Johns River. That's critical if we're going to be successful as an organization and as a community in protecting the river. We do that through education. We have an education staff that goes into the schools. Obviously now they're not going into schools, but we're doing it virtually. We're also do a lot of outreach to engage the community through cleanups and different volunteer opportunities, and also calls to action. So we really need the public engaged in terms of interacting with our elected officials and the policymakers and community leaders to make sure that we're making good decisions and good policy decisions for the St. John. Our work spans the watershed. So we represent the entire St. Johns River, which that's about almost 9,000 square miles of the state of Florida that drains into the St. Johns River. And so that's about 14% of the state of Florida consists of the watershed of St. John. So we really represent a huge area. That's 310 miles long and starts down west of Vero Beach in a marsh and then slowly starts meandering north until it reaches the Atlantic Ocean at Mayport. The river is a very slow-moving river, and I'll just tell you this because I think it's always an important point. I've been asked my whole life growing up in Jacksonville. Actually, I believed it growing up in Jacksonville that there was only a handful of rivers that flow north, and one's the Nile, and there's like 3 others, including the St. John. It's not true, actually. There's quite a few that flow in a northerly direction. What really, and it's fairly unique, but what really makes the St. John's unique is it only drops about 27 feet over that 310 miles. So it's a very slow-moving system. In some places, it's literally flat, like around Palatka. So what happens is when you get closer to the ocean and you have the tidal influence twice a day, you have a river that sloshes back and forth. And so what we put into the river, what we do to the river, actually takes a long time for the river to flush itself. And so pollution can stay in for quite a long time. And that's really something to keep in mind in all of these issues we talk about is the gradient and the slow flow of the river, because that has an effect on what happens with pollution and some of the impacts that human impacts on the river. The other thing too is that the river or the organization, we've also been really involved in trying to raise awareness about, obviously, about the impacts of climate change. This is something that's fairly new for us, actually, though. We were not really that involved with climate change issues up until a few years ago, but really opened our eyes and made us realize we really have to delve into this issue was when we had Hurricane Irma. And it was an issue that also really crystallized some issues around the dredging as well. But when that storm came through, as all of us remember, if you were in Jacksonville or anywhere in the state of Florida, frankly, it came past Jacksonville. It was not even a Category 1 hurricane anymore. It had been downgraded to a tropical storm, and it was about 70 miles west of us. And yet, even in that situation where we had we had a storm that didn't even hit us directly and was well to the west, it still caused historic flooding in downtown Jacksonville and some of the historic neighborhoods. And that just showed us how vulnerable we are as a community, not only to sea level rise and to storms that are becoming more powerful, but also it showed us even the dredging and how when we go deeper in the river, we can actually increase water levels, increase storm surge in the St. John.
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy. Hurricane Irma, I think, and we say this often, but it really was a wake-up call because it wasn't a direct storm. It wasn't a direct hit to here in Jacksonville, but for many, it definitely felt like a direct hit. And so because we know that the future of climate change in our region means we will have more storms, not only more frequent, but lasting longer and bringing more precipitation, we know that Irma is not the anomaly that many have described it, but in fact is our future. And so because we know that the impact of Hurricane Irma on the St. Johns River was that it brought damage to our public infrastructure, that it brought a toxic soup of sewage, and that flooding pollution will only increase, it was imperative that we at St. John's Riverkeeper continued to work for a more resilient river so that we could potentially find some solutions to mitigate these impacts. And just to sort of, really hit home, every single flood event is an unmitigated new source of pollution to the river. So every single one of these thunderstorms or major storms brings with it the contamination from our roads, from our homes, from our driveways, all of those retention ponds that are meant to hold and store nutrients and sediments, impacts from our agricultural lands and golf courses, sanitary sewer overflows in our wastewater treatment facilities that can't handle the level of surge that's coming in from precipitation from storms, as well as debris from everything, from trees and grasses and mulches and roadways, anything not secured, and in many cases when it comes to docks, things that are secured, those all end up impacting the St. Johns River. So what St. John's Riverkeeper needed to do was figure out, how do we elevate this conversation? And 1 year after Hurricane Irma, the truth is we didn't see that Jacksonville, at least Northeast Florida, had moved the ball along to make us feel like we were ready for that next big storm. We hit hurricane season in 2018 and looked around and said, what's changed? What's new? And so at St. John's Riverkeeper, we really had to take that and try to ourselves force a conversation to happen. And the way that we did that was by looking into immediately hosting town halls, bringing out the community to not only talk about the impacts to the river, but to also listen and to hear from the community what they suffered during Hurricane Irma, what their concerns were, what their fears were, and try to elevate that into action. From those town halls, more than 1,000 people attended, sent postcards, and asked our community leaders to take action. And from that, we actually created a resiliency pledge where every single candidate running for office in 2019 had to pledge whether or not they were going to take immediate action for resiliency solutions and protections if they were elected. The goal of all of this was to talk about rising waters, to engage with people. But I think this conversation really began in earnest with the publication of the special report by the Florida Times-Union, As the Ocean Creeps In. As the Ocean Creeps In seemed to elevate issues that we at St. John's Riverkeeper have been discussing for years, trying to raise the alarm about the proposed dredging of the St. John's River, which we're going to talk about soon. This special report went into depth discussing the facts about tidal range in the river, the fact that it's increasing, that the bottom of the river is more like a straight paved trail than it ever has been in its history, that the long-term changes, the alterations that we've made to the river from a depth of 12 to 18 feet at its mouth, now to more than 40 feet at its mouth over the last 100 years, means that salt water is able to move farther inland. And further, that the proposed 7-foot dredging project could increase water levels in a 100-year storm surge by 3 to 6 inches in the main stem, by up to 8 inches closer to the mouth. And so today what we're going to do is begin this series, this solution series, and continue our discussion about the solutions to a rising river and rising waters by looking back at this article to find out what we learned from it and to ask ourselves again if we are ready for the next big storm. And if the answer is no, then we're going to continue to talk about some of the solutions that we're going to propose in some of the forthcoming episodes. But right now, Jimmy, I was hoping you might be able to give us just a quick background on the work that St. John's Riverkeeper has done to elevate the discussion around dredging the St. John's River over the last decade or more.
Yeah, and I'll be brief on it, but it really goes back to 2011 or 2012 when they first started proposing the dredging project. And we were obviously concerned. When you're going from a depth of 40 feet for a distance of 13 miles of the river, and you're deepening it to 47 feet, that's a significant increase in the depth of the river, which means that you're going to have significant impacts to the health of the St. John. We followed along in this process and participated and provided comments. Some of our concerns were many. Obviously, one of the things that happens when you go deeper, it actually causes saltwater wedge to push farther upriver. And so it changes the chemistry of the river farther upstream, and which can be really devastating for freshwater wetlands and trees and submerged grasses, which are so critical. They're such important habitat in the St. Johns River. Also increases erosion. You have bigger waves from these larger ships that are coming through. We had concerns about sedimentation increasing and the rate of sedimentation dropping out. So there's all kinds of concerns that we had, and we were really engaged in this process, focused a lot on the salinity, honestly, and how that was going to change upriver. So we had been proposing for quite some time, actually, as mitigation, which we felt like there was inadequate mitigation. There still is, by the way. We were proposing that we restore the Ocklawaha River, and we're still advocating for that today. That would have a huge benefit for the St. Johns, would help offset some of these impacts. And we'll go into that at another time. But one of the things that I think was interesting, so we decided to file a lawsuit. And then after Irma, we obviously, as we mentioned, we realized that some of the concerns that we had raised in terms of the increased water levels in the river that result from the dredging and the increased storm surge, it was actually a much bigger problem than we thought. We had been focused more on the salinity issues for quite some time. This really did magnify the problem, and why just a few inches changes in the water levels or the storm surge of the river can be devastating for a community, which also, as Shannon mentioned earlier, can be devastating for the river in terms of additional pollution that makes its way into the water. So I want to say real quick too, is that as the ocean creeps in, we were actually when that came out, we were having some internal conversation. What do we do? What do we do to elevate the conversation? We were thinking maybe we just do a one-off seminar or something, a forum, and have people come and learn about this. But then when this came out, it really crystallized for us what we needed to do. It was such a powerful special report done by Nate and his colleague, Chris Hong, and of course the team at the Florida Times-Union, that we felt we've got to take this on the road. We need to take this on a road show and make sure that more people understand the implications of dredging and what we've done over time. And so that was when we reached out to Nate and to Chris and said, we're going to put together a panel of experts and let's take this thing on the road. And we did. and it was very successful. But I'm really excited to have Nate back because everybody was very, I think, received those forums with open arms, were really excited about it and wanted more, frankly. And we can look back now and kind of find out what the impetus of this project was and where we stand today.
Thanks, Jimmy. So with that being said, I just want to take a minute and introduce Nate Monroe. He is a reporter and columnist with the Florida Times-Union that, as Jimmy mentioned, co-authored the special report As the Ocean Creeps In, which really, I think, just broke the ceiling when it comes to the discussion about the long-term impacts of dredging and alterations of the St. Johns and what it means for those of us that live in any part of the St. Johns River, because it's all connected. And so with that, Nate, I want to open it up to you and just start off with what was the impetus for writing this article? What really sparked it all for you?
Sure. And guys, thanks for having me on. Maybe great minds think alike. I mean, look, Hurricane Irma happened in 2017, and we were as shocked by the historic flooding in downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods as anybody else. And I think it's clear to everyone who sees a pod of dolphins feeding in the middle of the river in downtown that, this isn't just a normal river. This is the river is oceanic, and it's got oceanic conditions for a considerable length. And we wanted to know if it had always been that way and how the river had changed over time. I mean, it just seemed like kind of a logical place to go after Irma. And lo and behold, we found that the river has been changed considerably, not for no reason, but because we have changed it.
What do you think, Nate, has stuck with you since publishing the article most? I mean, we're now, 2 years later, and we're still talking about this special report. What has sort of been lasting for you in the work that you and Chris did to sort of break this story?
One thing that I thought was fairly striking, a lot of times when you start a project or you're trying to look into an issue that feels like a really big one, you find that there are a lot of nuances that maybe what you thought going in is you're going to find stuff that kind of challenges some of what you were expecting to find. Look, in this case, I mean, it is natural to assume that all of the dredging over the last century would have changed the river considerably, and that's exactly what has happened. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of evidence that the river has transformed considerably in this first kind of 20-mile stretch near the ocean. I mean, it's, I think that's, something that definitely stuck with us. I mean, this is the mouth of the river 100 years ago would empty out to as little as 6 feet in low tide. And today it ranges up to 50 feet. That's just, ridiculous. And to this day, I think we continue to be surprised at the lack of curiosity or interest in the effects that these changes mean for us by our decision makers, by city officials, by the port, by the Army Corps. It just seems like there's not a lot of interest in figuring out and quantifying what these changes mean.
Well, that's something, Nate, that's always struck with me too is, to this day, the Army Corps of Engineers has still never done a cumulative assessment of the impacts over that period of time. Now, of course, part of the reason they claim is there's not enough data to make that assessment. But as you guys pointed out in the article, there is quite a bit of data that's just hasn't been uncovered yet or is sitting in archives.
Sure. I think there's data in their own reports that show that there could be considerable impacts. It's just that the Corps makes some subjective judgments that, 8 inches in some parts of the river, that's not a big increase in storm surge. I mean, if you live in that part of the river, it might be a huge change.
Absolutely.
Nate, one of the things in each of those town halls that I think stuck with me and stuck with a lot of people is this concept of a superhighway to the sea. And I'm hoping you can sort of recreate that for folks that maybe don't understand the sort of what I thought was the most groundbreaking of what came out of that is this idea of what is the superhighway to the sea.
Sure. So, part of the story, we talked to extensively a couple of researchers who specifically have been looking at for several years the impact or the correlation between dredging and increased storm surge in waterways. Something that you might assume would be studied quite a bit, especially in this day and age, but there's actually not a lot of scholarship out there on it. And something that they told us helped us kind of visualize this in the story. The issue of storm surge is that, of course, the St. John's at one time was a very slow moving, meandering river. And for most of its expanse, it still is. But as you get closer to the ocean, what these man-made changes have done, if you think about taking out your bike and going on a bike ride through a winding trail through the woods, that is a harder bike ride than, traveling a mile on a straight, smooth, freshly asphalted road. That dredging makes a river, it takes the kind of winding trail with debris on it and turns it more into the asphalt road. It removes underwater sand dunes and grass beds and rocks, things that create friction in the actual river. That friction, those are the things that slow storm surge waves. And deepening plays an impact too. It's a little bit harder to visualize the deepening aspect of it, but you're essentially scooping out all of the debris that would slow down a wave, and you're making the river more efficient. You're making it more like a highway.
Yeah.
I thought that analogy was great, because I think that's the thing that people don't realize is, that what we're doing to the river is every time we change it, we're making ourselves more vulnerable. And I think that's the issue that y'all really raised, is showing that over. I think the thing that struck me about your piece, as somebody that was born and raised in Jacksonville, it was a history lesson. And that was one of the things I don't think a lot of people really understand in Jacksonville. They don't understand the history of the St. John's in terms of how we have altered and changed it over time. And it's not the river by any means what it was, 120 years ago. And we've changed it significantly. And so I think you really raised the question, which a lot of people don't ask, is what are the consequences of all of that? What is the price, in other words, that we're paying now for some of the damage that was done before? So that was that. And I've got a question for you too, real quick, to follow up is, you've done this report and you really raised a lot of awareness about the impacts. What do you think is, if you could do another special report, what would the follow-up be? Now that you've kind of discovered a lot of information that you didn't know before, what would be the follow-up if you could do it?
That's a really good question. If I had a really solid idea that I was really confident with going forward on it, we probably maybe would have done it by now. But I would like to understand the Corps' decision-making process a little bit better. Something that you guys are aware of, and we've reported before, but I don't think we've ever really kind of dove into is, when the Army Corps started this project, the Corps budgeted $80 million for environmental mitigation work. That may have not included storm surge, like work that might mitigate a storm surge, but for ecological impacts, that's a significant amount of money. The project as it stands today has $0 for mitigation, and there's some monitoring. And the Corps today is just extremely intransigent about their findings. I mean, they budgeted $80 million, they deleted it, and now they're just super confident that this project is going to change the river so little that we need no money budgeted for mitigation. Like, it's just I would like to understand that process better, and you know, making records requests from the federal government can take forever. But there is got to be some public record that sheds light on that, and that's something that, you know, maybe you say it's like left on the editing room floor, something I would like to have jumped into a little bit more.
Well, and that's something I think that's important. A lot of this is, you know, it's really hard to, and it's hard to challenge though in court and any decisions that they make. I do want to say something though for folks that may have heard that there's mitigation out there. When Nate says there's no mitigation, what they did appropriate or did require is it's about $2.5 million to buy some conservation lands, but that's really not technically mitigation. They call it mitigation, but it's not, because what it is, you're buying some land that's already in a natural state along the river, and it's doing nothing to offset the impacts that will occur. And that's really the heart of what mitigation is. Mitigation is compensating in some way for the damage that's done and helping to offset it. The other thing too is they do have money for monitoring, but like as Nate said, this is after the fact. We've even been told off the record before, you know, that it'd be really challenging to ever tease out whether any damage that was done was the result of the dredging. There's just too much what they call noise in the system. You're going to have climate change and sea level rise and all these things. And it'd be really hard to pin the impacts directly on the dredging. And so the likelihood that we would ever, if they even do find that there's impacts that are potentially caused by the dredging, the likelihood of us actually getting any mitigation after the fact is pretty slim.
Nate, this is more a question of sort of, you know, you work so much internally with politics, so it's just a question about that. But do you think that the city is going to be able to cough up the $70 million that Jack Sport's asking for to finish the cost share of the project?
Yeah, I do. I think that, I mean, the city has the financial capacity to make that commitment. Now, whether that is something that ought to be prioritized, particularly in the day and age we find ourselves recently, I think that's a fair argument. But, you know, every indication is that the mayor and the council really believe in dredging, and 70 million is a lot of money. But I mean, the city has plenty of capacity to borrow that if they wanted, and I think they will.
Nate, when you go into when you're doing a story like this as a reporter, is your mindset where you feel like, okay, we've really exposed, I think, some of the problems with dredging and the historical impacts? Do you have expectations that it'll change public policy, or are you kind of cynical and just think, oh, you know, it's not going to have much of a difference? Or, I mean, you know, and then of course, a kind of a follow-up to that is, so do you think that it has had an impact on the city, and what are those results?
You know, so I was a reporter when my colleague and I wrote that story, and I've in the time since then, I'm a columnist now, and so I think that my underlying cynicism comes through sometimes in those columns. I can be a bit cynical about it. I don't know that I expected that story to impact the way that the city's posture toward dredging. But what I was hopeful for, and what I think has happened, is that I just think the public is a bit more educated on it. I mean, this is not some slam dunk project. I think that, you know, a reasonable portion of the public has mixed feelings about this. And I think that that's appropriate. I think that this project certainly will provide some benefit to the economy, but it's going to come with costs. It's going to come with short-term and long-term costs. And, you know, the more that we can explain what those long-term costs are, even if we don't fully know, I mean, we don't know, you know, is 7 feet going to be the difference between a hurricane putting Jacksonville, you know, in a catastrophic state and, you know, versus merely somewhat damaged? I mean, it's pretty hard to say, but there is a cost to it. There is a cost when we turn the river into something that wears on our drainage systems, on our bulkheads, And so I do think people are more informed about that, or at least I hope they are.
Well, and I would say that you have had an impact. And, I'd like to think our work in the River Rising series that we did in collaboration with you guys helped, because I do think the city at least is addressing resiliency issues now when they weren't even discussing it before. So I like to think we've made a little bit of impact, but I think we've got a long way to go, obviously.
I agree with you on that. I actually do think the city, and I don't know if the story in the town halls, sometimes politicians don't like to admit the reasons why they become interested in new topics. But since all of that, the city does have an interest in resiliency now. And they're not probably taking it as urgently as I would request them to, but they're doing something, which is more than before.
Well, that was really my next question for you, and I think you answered it. But the city at this point, 2 years later, I can't say they're not doing anything, to elevate the conversation. There's been significant work done from the mayor's administration to look at what is the low-hanging fruit when it comes to drainage. There was the Adaptation Action Area Working Group that came out with about 40 recommendations for the next 5 years that need to be taken on policies for, adapting our vulnerable coastal areas and policies for that. And then now there is a new special committee on resiliency that was recently formed by City Council member Matt Carlucci that I think is on the right track, because he's engaging, I want to say, 7 council members in that process. For anyone that is listening in, there is a subcommittee formation that he just sort of established that the public can get involved with and serve on different subcommittees based on your expertise or your interest. And so all those are good things. But I want to just segue real quickly to the reality of what's happening right now in our world. And, Nate, you wrote, I think, I don't know what I would, I don't know how I would express my comments after reading your article, The Broken Promise That Broke Jacksonville. But I would just say I needed a minute to reflect and to really think about it. And it was really phenomenal and incredible work from you. So thank you for that. But can you sort of connect maybe some of the issues that you highlighted in that article with the discussion today, because they're not totally foreign from each other?
No, I don't think that they are. The thrust of the column is not something new to, maybe people who really regularly read the news. We have a consolidated form of government. The county and the city are part of this one vast municipal government, the largest in Florida. And when this consolidation happened in 1968, it was this really celebrated government reform and was expected to improve quality of life for everyone in the city. At the time, before consolidation in the old city, Black residents were on a track to become a majority voting bloc. Consolidating would mean that they would be giving up that possibility of having such a powerful political influence for a generation, at least. Consolidation got support in the Black community in large part because the kind of white establishment that came up with the idea promised that all of these old core city neighborhoods were going to get infrastructure improvements that were badly needed then. Things like city water and sewer line extensions and paved roads. 50 years later, more than 50 years later, some of those neighborhoods are in remarkably similar positions to where they were in 1968. It's really a shame of the city that promise, and these were explicit promises. I mean, these are things that are you can find in government documents. That this isn't just like Black voters just made up this idea that they were promised these things. They were promised real infrastructure improvements. The city has never prioritized that as a major expense in the budget. And as a result, most of that work's never been done. And I think one of the reasons that work's never been done is because the city instead prioritizes what I think are top-down kind of economic development projects, whether it's subsidizing, projects like Lot J by the stadium, or dredging, which is, frankly, something that's going to benefit some shipping companies quite a bit, and arguably a group of a sizable group of people who work at those companies in Jacksonville. But most of the benefits are going to accrue on a corporate level, and that really is not going to improve. That's not going to really help us move toward fulfilling any of these consolidation promises. And that's $70 million is a tremendous amount of money, and we've spent a decade fighting to get the federal government to subsidize this dredging project. And all the time and energy that we spent on that is something that we could have been spending on something like making the city a nice place to live for a lot of people. So none of these projects exist in a vacuum. When we decide to pursue something, we're deciding not to pursue something else. And we never went through that analysis in deciding to dredge the river. No one ever thinks of these projects that way, but that's the truth.
I think another thing that your article brought up that we know through our work to fight for resiliency is that many of the neighborhoods that are the most susceptible and vulnerable to these flooding impacts and the pollution impacts and the toxic sewage pollution side effects from flooding are also are communities that never received the promises that were made during consolidation. And so there's a big overlap with the resiliency conversation and with the need to think about who's being impacted by these decisions most. And whether or not those conversations are happening in a way that all these communities are at the table as these decisions are being discussed now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a kind of infamous city government story that in the summer of 1989, during these budget discussions, a group of Black city council members walked out and refused to approve the budget because there was no money for drainage improvements in some areas of the city they represented that had just experienced like a week of flooding problems. So they walked out of the meeting and the council president ordered them arrested and brought back. And so, I mean, this is not a new issue, but to your point, yeah, I mean, one of the legacy problems in some of these older core city neighborhoods is inadequate drainage. And that is only going to get worse and has only gotten worse in the intervening decades.
Well, and rising sea level rise is obviously exacerbating that problem. And then we build projects, like the dredging that just actually accelerates the impacts of sea level rise and makes them even more vulnerable. And that's the sad thing I think about a lot of this is that a lot of the impacts that we're having on our planet, it's the most vulnerable communities that are going to be hit the hardest and are going to have the hardest to be able to recover, frankly.
Absolutely.
This series that we are kicking off today, that we're about to launch, it's all about solutions. And so your article highlights, I think, a really big problem, but it's also really the starting place for this conversation, because what we're doing to the river now and the changes that you really broke in publishing that piece, those are our new reality. They're the starting place, and that's what we need to accept in order to move forward and really talk about the solutions to moving forward and to a more resilient community and a more resilient St. Johns River. So as we close out on the conversation today, discussing as the ocean creeps in, do you think that our watershed is ready for some of these bold solutions that we're going to talk about in this series?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think the river is at a critical point. There are I mean, there are so many stories happening along the St. Johns River, whether it's questions about development farther south, dredging, salinity. Um, I mean, this is really the time. And now that the city government is engaged, at least on resiliency issues, I think it is a good time to start talking about these things. And there are council members who want to hear more on this topic and who do seem legitimately ready to engage. And that has not always been the case. I think you guys would know that better than anybody.
Jimmy, what about you? Do you think that Jacksonville, that Northeast Florida, that the St. Johns River watershed is ready to talk about some of these solutions to addressing these resiliency concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly the fact that Matt Carlucci seems so enthusiastic about, continuing this conversation with his committee, he seems very sincere and earnest about this. I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic, even though, I try to be. I've always joked, if you're not optimistic, you'll probably kill yourself being an environmentalist. But I think the thing that, I think that we've got a long way to go. It's a good first step. So I'm going to give Matt, Councilman Carlucci and the others some credit for pushing this along. But I think also we've got to address the root causes of climate change, and that this really isn't about addressing greenhouse gas emissions. It's really this resiliency conversation in Jacksonville right now is really treating the symptoms. And so that's something that's going to have to evolve. But, hey, at least we're talking about this. And, as Nate said, it was a long time that there was no conversations about this, and nobody frankly wanted to talk about this. And so I think we've made some progress.
We don't have any questions in our chat window, and we did get a few questions submitted prior to the discussion today, but we really kind of covered those in talking about what the city's doing right now, some of the initiatives, and whether or not we are optimistic about some of those outcomes. I'm not going to unmute all of the participants here, but I do want to open it up for anyone who wants to either unmute themselves themselves and join the conversation, or pose a question in the chat box. But if you have questions for Nate or questions for Jimmy or I or about this series, feel free to chime in.
And before they do, I want to reiterate what Shannon said, that, while today we really haven't talked so much about the solution so much. I mean, I've kind of touched on and hinted about, obviously, the Akawaha restoration, and that could be a huge benefit to the St. John. But I do think that, obviously I want you to know, we're going to get to the solutions in the next series. This was an important time to really reflect on some of the information that we know about dredging, about sea level rise, and the impacts of rising waters. And so I think we've got a great series, a lot of really great experts that are going to come in and talk about some of these specific solutions later in the series.
Hey, Dimitri, go ahead.
Hey, Shannon. Hey, Jimmy. Hey, Nate. Hey, everybody. Pardon my ignorance if I'm speaking in something that doesn't make any sense, but if the city's going to have to come up with the 70 million, is there any way to leverage that moment to try and come up with funds that might be attached to that could at least afford to do some mitigation, even if it's on a somewhat symbolic scale, given the sums of money it would take to do something, really extensive? Is that a moment? I don't really know who has.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Dimitri, that's one of the things that we're hopeful of, is that, we've said all along, honestly, that we felt like the best opportunity is when this comes before the city council. We were actually hoping it would have been earlier in the process, so
Right.
But not at the tail end. But that's really an opportunity. We were told for so long by city council members when we brought this to them before, they said, oh, well, there's no legislation before us, so we really can't, there's nothing we can do about it. Well, now they can. And we've had a lot of conversations with individual city council members and a lot of community leaders who most of them agree, yeah, there's not enough mitigation. They agree to that point. Matter of fact, today it was interesting too, the Times Union the editorial board had an editorial saying just that we need more mitigation for this project. So I think there's community support for that. Matter of fact, if you go back under the Brown administration, they had a port task force. Well, that port task force was community business leaders and community leaders and scientists, and their recommendation was to move forward with the dredging, but they said to do it with $25 million for restoring the Ocklawaha and an additional $25 million for local projects. So it's been vetted before in the community, and there was support for it. And I think there's still a lot of support. So yeah, we're going to have to really put some pressure on the city council and the mayor to say, if you're going to fund this,
Right.
we need to make sure that we're doing something to offset the impact.
Well, and as far as mitigation attempts, that is something that we can do locally. In other words, we as a municipality can affect those mitigation efforts.
Yes, and I think that there's a lot of things we could do. You know, there's a lot of creek restoration. I mean, one of the great resiliency projects that's taking place right now is McCoy's Creek.
Right.
So, you know, and of course, ultimately Hogan's Creek down the road. So those are projects that could be funded that are going to help in terms of resiliency. They're helping reduce flooding in some of those watersheds of those two creeks. And there's other creeks that certainly need restored as well that could help with this. We could even do things too, like removing septic tanks. I mean, there's a lot of things we could do to improve the health of the river. Sure. Challenge is that no matter, like you said earlier, no matter how much you appropriate to this, you're not going to offset all the impact. Right. But, you know, we really do need, like you said, leverage this opportunity to try to at least get something for the river.
Well, and to Nate's point, there's always an opportunity cost, and everybody's, you know, if money's going to be borrowed that's beyond the 70 million, people are going to have their feelings about that. But 70 could perhaps be 100 to 120 million. And at least if you do something, that establishes a bit of a beachhead in terms of the effort, which things could perhaps be built upon that in the future. So,
right.
I think that was I think that's an insightful question. And I agree with you and with Jimmy that this would be a good time to get some council members to commit money for mitigation. I mean, look, even if there's work the city wants to do in the river and they would need the Army Corps' help with, it helps tremendously for the city to be able to go to the Army Corps and say, look, we've already got, you know, a matching amount of money for this local match. You know, the Corps always wants local buy-in on these projects. So getting money appropriated, you know, that's usually the hardest part. So, and look, the port needs that 70 million for this project. I mean, this isn't just like, if they don't get it from the city, they'll find it somewhere else. I mean, it would really put the project in a lurch to not get that money. So, I mean, there is leverage there.
well, thank you. And I'll sign off with that, but just keep us posted. And as you know, I'm part of the Downtown Dwellers, Shannon. So we've worked with y'all before. So if something like that comes down the pike and you need our support, please let us know.
Great. Thanks for your participation. Jim, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for doing this tonight. And not really a question, but a couple of comments. First comment is, nice quarantine beard, Nate. Haven't seen you with that before. The other thing is, I find it ironic that one of the major economic trends going on in our country right now, and in Jacksonville as well, is a move towards reshoring reshoring manufacturing back to the U.S. Locally, Councilman Rory Diamond has said that he's going to put forth a proposal to require the city of Jacksonville to buy a certain percentage of their needs from U.S. suppliers. So this is something that's happening really across the U.S., but it's definitely happening here in the U.S. or in Jacksonville. Well, you know, the selling point of deepening the port was that we could allow bigger ships to bring in more goods from China. And I can see a time when we may get down to 47 feet and be declining in terms of what we bring in from China and other Asian countries every year. So I just find that ironic.
That larger political context, the port has never addressed how the dredging project makes sense in terms of, like, I actually remember asking a former port CEO in an editorial board meeting about Trump's comments. He was a candidate at the time about, you know, starting a trade war with China. And, you know, he kind of gave me this gritted teeth smile that was just like, come on, man, like, what am I supposed to say? I mean, you know, in the Army Corps, I mean, even if you take out some of this, you know, some of the more recent discussion about onshoring manufacturing. The Army Corps has never studied whether it makes sense to dredge basically every major port along the East Coast. You know, there's not, every port is not going to benefit equally. And so, I mean, there's just like a total lack of analysis about whether any of that, you know, makes the dredging make more sense or not. I don't think it's, you know, I don't think it helps the cost benefit analysis for Jacksonville.
I
Well,
want
that's
to
a whole other show. We could do a whole podcast.
Oh yeah.
now I want to thank everyone for participating in the discussion tonight. And Nate Monroe, I specifically want to thank you for aiding us in your expertise, and of course for all the time that you took in publishing the special report as the ocean creeps in. So thank you so much for that. I want to end today with a promo of our next episode that will air in 2 weeks, June 17th, 2020 at 7 p.m. Episode 2. Solutions are that we will be discussing is, can a wall protect us? And we will be joined by guest speaker Eric Olson, coastal engineer at Olson Associates. Many cities are looking to the Netherlands as a model for engineered solutions as a way to hold water back. Are these structural solutions that work in other cities the right fit for us here in Florida and in the St. Johns River? So tune in then. Thanks again, Nate, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. Have a good night.
Thank you guys.